To anyone else, the iconic winged skull patch on the unconscious man's leather vest would be a terrifying warning to keep driving. Arthur, however, didn't care about the Hells Angels insignia, nor the gruesome mixture of black engine oil and crimson blood staining the asphalt. He only saw a dying man, and Arthur was never one to just walk away. Highway 50 in Nevada didn't earn the title of the loneliest road in America for nothing. It was a brutal, unforgiving stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through the barren high desert, a place where the sun baked the earth to bone and the nights froze the breath in your lungs. For Arthur Carrington, a 72-year-old retired diesel mechanic and Vietnam veteran, the isolation wasn't a curse. It was a sanctuary. Since his wife, Martha, passed away 5 years ago, Arthur's only companions were a one-eyed hound named Buster and the relentless, howling desert wind. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when the storm hit. The sky bruised into a violent shade of purple, and sheets of freezing rain began to hammer against the corrugated tin roof of Arthur's remote cabin. He was sitting by the wood stove, nursing a mug of black coffee, when the sound cut through the thunder. It wasn't the natural rumble of the storm. It was the distinct, guttural roar of a V-twin engine being pushed to its absolute limit, followed by the terrifying high-pitched screech of tires locking up on wet pavement. Then came the sickening crunch of metal tearing into earth and stone. Buster barked, the fur on his spine standing up. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy canvas coat, a high-powered mag light, and his trauma kit, a remnant from his days as a medic in the Ia Drang Valley that he meticulously kept restocked. He fired up his rusted 1980 Ford F250 and crawled down his dirt driveway toward the highway, the headlights cutting weak, yellow swaths through the torrential rain. About 2 miles down the road, near a treacherous bend known to locals as Dead Man's Curve, Arthur found the wreck. A custom, heavily modified Harley-Davidson lay on its side in the muddy ditch, its front wheel bent at a grotesque angle, the headlight shattered, but the turn signal still blinking a steady, eerie amber against the sagebrush. Steam hissed violently from the scorching exhaust pipes as the cold rain hit them. Arthur swept his flashlight beam through the darkness. 20 yards away, thrown clear into a patch of sharp rocks and rabbit brush, lay the rider. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavy denim and scuffed black leather. Arthur knelt beside him, the rain soaking through his own jeans instantly. The man was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rattling. Blood flowed freely from a deep gash above his left eye, mixing with the mud, and his right leg was twisted unnaturally. But it was the back of the man's leather cut that made Arthur pause. Illuminated by the flashlight was the unmistakable insignia, the grinning skull wearing a winged motorcycle helmet. The Death's Head. Above it, the top rocker read Hells Angels, and the bottom rocker read California. On the front, a small patch read Oakland. Arthur knew exactly what he was looking at. This wasn't a weekend warrior. This was a fully patched member of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world. Bringing a man like this into his home was inviting a chaotic, violent world into his quiet sanctuary. The police wouldn't like it. The locals would be terrified. The man groaned, a wet, choking sound that snapped Arthur out of his hesitation. He checked the biker's pulse, thready and weak. If Arthur waited for an ambulance to come from Ely, an hour away in this storm, this man would drown in his own blood or die of hypothermia. "All right, son," Arthur muttered, his voice gravelly. "Let's get you out of the rain." Using every ounce of his residual farm boy strength, Arthur managed to drag the massive biker onto a heavy canvas tarp he kept in the truck bed. It was agonizing work. The man had to weigh 250 pounds easily. Arthur's arthritic knees screamed in protest, and his chest heaved, but he hauled the tarp up the makeshift ramp of his tailgate, inch by painful inch, until the biker was secure in the bed. Before leaving, Arthur took a heavy chain from his truck, hooked it to the Harley's frame, and dragged the wrecked bike deep into the thick brush, hiding it from the road. He didn't know why the man had crashed, but out here, out of sight meant out of trouble. Back at the cabin, Arthur transformed his kitchen table into a triage center. He cut away the biker's wet clothes, carefully avoiding the sacred leather cut, which he draped over a chair, and went to work. The biker's name, according to a weathered California driver's license in his wallet, was Jackson Miller. But the tattoos across his knuckles spelled out JAXX. Jax had 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a fractured tibia. Arthur cleaned the head wound, stitched it with steady hands that hadn't forgotten the muscle memory of war, and set the shoulder with a sickening pop that caused Jax to thrash in his unconscious state. He splinted the leg using wood from his workshop and bound the ribs tight. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, bitterly cold morning. Arthur sat in his rocking chair, exhausted, watching the rising sun paint the desert gold, while the notorious Hell's Angel slept off the trauma on a makeshift bed in the corner of the room. Jackson Jax Miller woke to the smell of frying bacon and the harsh sting of antiseptic. His eyes snapped open, immediately scanning the room. The instincts of a man who had spent his life surviving in a cutthroat underworld kicked in. He wasn't in a hospital. He was in a rustic, wood-paneled cabin. He tried to sit up, and a white-hot agony flared in his chest and leg, forcing a sharp hiss through his teeth. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a calm voice said. Jax turned his head. Sitting at a small wooden dining table was an older man with a face like weathered leather, white hair tied back, calmly eating eggs. "Where the hell am I?" Jax demanded, his voice a raspy growl. He instinctively reached for the K-bar knife he always kept at his waist, only to realize he was wearing nothing but a pair of oversized flannel pajama pants. Panic flared. "Where's my cut?" "Over there," Arthur said, pointing a fork toward the armchair by the fireplace. Jax's leather vest, his colors, rested exactly where he could see it. "Your bike is hidden out back under a tarp. You're off Highway 50. I found you in a ditch." Jax stared at the old man, assessing him. He saw the military posture, the steady hands, the utter lack of fear. Most citizens recoiled when they saw the patch. This old man was looking at him like he was just a stray dog he'd pulled out of the rain. "You a doctor?" Jax asked, touching the neat row of stitches on his forehead. "Combat medic, 1st Cavalry." "Long time ago," Arthur replied, standing up to pour a second mug of coffee. He walked over and handed it to Jax. "Drink. You lost blood." Jax took the mug, wincing as his bruised muscles stretched. "Why didn't you call the cops or an ambulance?" "Out here, an ambulance would have taken too long. You'd be dead," Arthur said simply. "As for the police, Sheriff Riley and his deputies ain't exactly the helpful sort. Figured a man wearing your jacket wouldn't want the county sniffing around while he's flat on his back." A dark shadow crossed Jax's face at the mention of the police. He took a sip of the coffee. "You saved my life." "I did. I'm Jax." "Arthur." For the next 3 days, an uneasy but respectful truce existed in the cabin. Arthur tended to Jax's wounds, changing dressings and forcing him to eat hearty stews to regain his strength. Jax, despite his gruff exterior and the violent tattoos sprawling up his neck, proved to be a stoic patient. He watched Arthur meticulously, noticing how the old man lived entirely off the grid, relying on solar panels, a deep well, and a stubborn sense of independence. On the evening of the 3rd day, as Arthur was cleaning his rifle by the fire, Jax finally spoke about the crash. "I didn't lose control of my bike," Jax said quietly, staring into the flames. Arthur looked up, a rag in one hand, a bottle of Hops No. 9 in the other. "I figured. The skid marks on the road. You were braking hard, but you were pushed, side-swiped." Jax nodded slowly. "I was carrying something. Cash, a lot of it. Club funds from a run in Salt Lake, heading back to Oakland. A black SUV started tailing me right after I crossed the Nevada state line. They bumped my rear fender at 80 miles an hour. Sent me flying." "They get the cash?" Arthur asked. "No," Jax said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Saddlebags held tight. The money is still locked in the right pannier." "Lucky," Arthur muttered. "It wasn't luck," Jax said, his voice dropping an octave. "It was a setup. The only people who knew my route were local law enforcement. Someone tipped them off." Before Arthur could respond, Buster the Hound let out a ferocious, echoing bark. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside made both men freeze. Arthur stood up, peering through the gap in the curtains. His stomach dropped. A white county sheriff's cruiser, heavily dusted with dirt, was parked near the porch. Stepping out of it was Sheriff Thomas Riley, a broad-shouldered, arrogant man who ran the county like his own personal fiefdom. "It's the sheriff," Arthur whispered. Jax immediately reached for his leather cut, his eyes hardening into flint. "Hide my stuff." Arthur shoved Jax's cut, his boots, and his knife into a hidden compartment under the floorboards beneath the rug. "Get in the back bedroom. Don't make a sound." Jax hobbled into the dark bedroom, just as a heavy fist pounded on the front door. "Arthur, open up! It's Sheriff Riley." Arthur took a deep breath, smoothed his expression into one of mild annoyance, and opened the door. "Evening, Tom. What brings you out here in the cold?" Sheriff Riley pushed past Arthur without an invitation, his heavy boots tracking mud onto the floor. He slowly looked around the cabin, his hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon. "Looking for a ghost, Arthur," Riley said, his eyes scanning the kitchen table. "Got a report of a motorcycle crash out by Dead Man's Curve a few nights ago. Found some broken plastic, a lot of blood, but no bike, no rider." "Can't say I heard anything," Arthur lied smoothly. "Storm was loud. I was asleep." Riley walked toward the wood stove, lingering near the hallway that led to the bedroom where Jax was hiding. "Is that so? Funny thing. We tracked the blood into the brush. Looked like someone dragged something heavy away. Maybe loaded it into a truck." Riley turned to face Arthur, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You wouldn't be hiding a fugitive, would you, old man? Because harboring a known criminal, that could lead to property seizure. And we both know the county has been wanting this land of yours for that new development project." "I don't know what you're talking about, Tom," Arthur said, his voice steel. "I live alone. You know that." Riley stared at him for a long, suffocating moment. Then he chuckled darkly. "All right, Arthur. But if I find out you're lying, I'll take this cabin, your land, and I'll throw you in a cell so deep you'll forget what the sun looks like." Riley tipped his hat and walked out. As he pulled away, Arthur watched from the window. The cruiser's headlights illuminated a deep, fresh scratch and a dent on the front right bumper of the sheriff's vehicle. Arthur's blood ran cold. He walked back into the living room as Jax limped out of the shadows. "He's the one," Jax said softly, his fists clenched. "That was the voice of the guy who leaned out the window of the SUV before they hit me. He changed vehicles, but it's him. He wants the club's money." Arthur sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Riley has been trying to force me off my land for 2 years. He's corrupt. He wants to sell my water rights to a corporate farm. Now, he knows you're here. He's putting the pieces together. I need to leave, Jax said immediately. "I'm bringing heat on you. That wasn't the deal. You can't ride. Your leg is busted," Arthur pointed out. "I don't need my leg to twist a throttle," Jax countered fiercely. "I need my bike." For the next 48 hours, Arthur barely slept. He dragged his heavy tools out to the brush and worked like a madman under the tarp. He used a sledgehammer to straighten the Harley's forks, welded a makeshift brace for the frame, and patched the punctured oil line with a piece of copper tubing and hose clamps. It was a Frankenstein repair job, ugly and dangerous, but the V-twin engine fired up with a deafening roar. On the 5th night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Jax straddled the battered Harley. He wore his cut, the death's head grinning in the dark. He looked at Arthur, extending a heavily calloused, tattooed hand. "I won't forget this, Arthur," Jax said, his grip like a vice. "You stepped into the line of fire for a stranger, for an angel. Just ride safe, son," Arthur said quietly, "and stay clear of this county." Jax kicked the bike into gear. He paused, looking back at the old mechanic. "The club pays its debts, Arthur," Jax said, his voice slicing through the rumble of the engine. "Always." With a twist of the throttle, Jax vanished into the black desert night, leaving Arthur alone once more. The old man walked back into his cabin, bolted the door, and waited for the fallout, knowing Sheriff Riley would be back. He just didn't know how little time he had left. For 3 days after Jax Miller disappeared into the freezing Nevada night, Highway 50 was agonizingly silent. Arthur Carrington fell back into his solitary routine, but a cold knot of anticipation sat heavy in his stomach. He kept his Vietnam-era M1 Garand loaded and leaning against the kitchen wall. He knew men like Sheriff Thomas Riley. They didn't let things go. They festered, and then they struck. The strike came on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening snow. Arthur was out by the woodshed, chopping kindling, when the crunch of tires echoed up the dirt driveway. It wasn't just one cruiser this time. 3 white, dust-caked county vehicles tore onto his property, completely surrounding the small cabin. Buster let out a frantic, vicious bark, baring his teeth as 6 men stepped out. Sheriff Riley led the pack, his hand resting on the holster of his Glock. His deputies fanned out, their faces hard, carrying pump-action shotguns. They weren't here to ask questions. They were here to clean up a mess. "Put the axe down, Arthur," Riley ordered, his voice echoing in the crisp, dead air. Arthur slowly lowered the splitting maul, his eyes scanning the deputies. "You're trespassing, Tom. You have a warrant?" "I don't need a warrant for a welfare check," Riley sneered, stepping closer. "And considering you've been harboring a fugitive who stole $250,000 in county evidence, I'd say your welfare is in serious jeopardy." "County evidence?" Arthur let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Is that what you call a biker club's cash that you tried to run off the road and steal?" Riley's expression darkened, the facade of law enforcement completely evaporating. He gestured to 2 of his deputies. "Toss the cabin. Find the money. If he tries anything, put him down." Buster lunged, snapping his jaws at the nearest deputy. The man raised his heavy steel-toed boot and kicked the old hound squarely in the ribs. Buster let out a sharp yelp and tumbled into the dirt, whimpering. "Hey!" Arthur roared, dropping the axe and lunging forward. Before Arthur could reach the deputy, Riley swung the heavy metal barrel of his flashlight, catching Arthur across the cheekbone. The world exploded in a flash of white light. Arthur hit the frozen ground hard, tasting copper and dust. His vision swam as Riley stood over him, blocking out the grey sky. "The biker is gone," Riley said softly, leaning down so only Arthur could hear. "We found tire tracks leading back to the highway, which means he took my money. But I'm not leaving empty-handed, Arthur. I've got investors in Las Vegas waiting for the deed to this land, and I am out of patience." Riley pulled a folded, crumpled document from his jacket and tossed it into the dirt next to Arthur's face. A pen followed. "Sign the property transfer. You do that, and I'll let you pack up your truck and your mutt, and you can drive away," Riley threatened. "You don't? Well, my deputies are going to find an illegal stash of narcotics in your woodshed. Then they're going to swear under oath that you resisted arrest and reached for a weapon. It's a tragedy, really. Crazy old war vet snaps." Arthur coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the snow-dusted ground. He slowly pushed himself up on his hands and knees, his head throbbing with a sickening rhythm. He looked at the deed, then looked up at the corrupt sheriff. The old mechanic's eyes were cold, reflecting the 1,000-yard stare he had perfected decades ago in the jungles of Southeast Asia. "You're a coward, Tom," Arthur rasped, his voice trembling not from fear, but from raw, suppressed rage. "You hide behind a badge to steal and murder. I bled for this country. I built this home with my own 2 hands and my wife's. I will die in this dirt before I give it to a piece of filth like you." Riley's face flushed crimson. He stepped back and nodded to his men. "All right. Have it your way." The deputies racked their shotguns, the metallic clack-clack echoing off the tin roof of the cabin. "Get back to the cars, boys," Riley instructed, pulling his own weapon. "Suspect is armed and barricaded. We're doing this by the book. Light the cabin up. If he runs out, drop him." Arthur scrambled to his feet, grabbing Buster by the scruff, and dove through the front door of the cabin just as the first 12-gauge slug tore through the wooden porch railing, showering him in splinters. He kicked the door shut, threw the heavy iron deadbolt, and flipped the solid oak table onto its side for cover. He snatched his M1 Garand from the wall, checking the N-block clip. 8 rounds, against 6 men with shotguns and AR-15. The math was a death sentence. Outside, Riley's voice bellowed through a megaphone. "This is your last chance, Carrington. You have 2 minutes to walk out with your hands up." Arthur sat on the floor, his back against the overturned table. He looked at Buster, who was panting heavily, pressing his warm body against Arthur's leg. Arthur reached out with a bloody hand and stroked the dog's ears. "It's all right, boy," Arthur whispered. "We had a good run." He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howling across the Nevada desert, preparing himself for the inevitable blast of gunfire. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. But the gunfire never came. Instead, the wind seemed to change its pitch. The low, mournful howl of the desert breeze began to vibrate, dropping into a deep, guttural frequency that rattled the teacups in Arthur's cupboards. It sounded like an earthquake rolling beneath the tectonic plates, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated right through the floorboards and into Arthur's bones. Outside, Sheriff Riley lowered his megaphone, looking confusedly toward the western horizon. The vibration grew into a roar. It was a deafening, unified thunder that completely swallowed the sound of the wind and the idling police cruisers. Arthur crawled to the window, peering carefully over the sill. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Over the ridge of Highway 50, a black wave was pouring onto the asphalt. It wasn't a dozen motorcycles. It was over 100. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, 2 abreast, a mile-long serpent of chrome, polished leather, and roaring V-twin engines. The afternoon sun broke through the grey clouds, glinting off the high-rise handlebars and the custom paint jobs. At the front of the pack, leading the thunderous cavalry, was a custom-built, matte-black Harley-Davidson trike. Riding it, his broken leg extended stiffly in a heavy cast, resting on a custom peg, was Jack's. Beside Jack's rode a man whose presence commanded absolute, terrifying authority. He was older, with a weathered face, wearing a pristine cut that bore the President patch. Anyone who knew anything about the outlaw biker world would recognize him instantly. It was a figure built in the exact mold of the legendary Ralph "Sonny" Barger, the godfather of the Hells Angels. The men behind them wore patches from Oakland, Vallejo, and nomads from across the West Coast. The filthy few patches gleamed on collars. Sergeant-at-Arms rockers were proudly displayed. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an invasion. The massive pack didn't stop on the highway. They turned down Arthur's dirt driveway, the sheer volume of their engines creating a physical wall of sound that forced Riley and his deputies to cover their ears. The bikers swarmed the property. They didn't draw weapons, they didn't shout, they simply used their machines, circling the 3 police cruisers in a perfectly orchestrated maneuver, boxing the deputies in entirely. The exhaust fumes created a thick, choking haze of blue smoke. Riley stood frozen, his Glock still in his hand, looking at a wall of 100 hardened Hells Angels. He was vastly, hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered. The deputies had already lowered their shotguns, their eyes wide with sheer panic. The engines cut off in a synchronized, abrupt silence that was almost more deafening than the roar. Jax stepped off his trike, heavily relying on a custom-carved wooden cane. He limped forward, his eyes locked dead on Sheriff Riley. The older president stepped off his bike alongside Jax, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're out of your jurisdiction, bikers," Riley stammered, trying to project a false bravado that completely failed. "This is a county police matter. Disperse immediately." Jax didn't even look at the deputies. He stopped 10 feet from Riley. "You made a mistake, Riley. You thought you hit a lone rider. You didn't realize you hit the entire club." The older president, his voice calm but laced with venom, spoke up. "We don't take kindly to thieves wearing badges, and we certainly don't take kindly to men who terrorize the people who help our brothers." "You've got nothing," Riley spat, his hand trembling on his gun. "It's your word against the law." "Actually," a new voice called out. From the back of the pack, a sleek black town car pulled through the parted sea of motorcycles. 2 men in sharp grey suits stepped out, flashing gold badges that glinted in the light. "FBI Sheriff Riley," the lead agent said, holding up a file. "We received a rather detailed package this morning from the club's legal counsel. Included dashcam footage from a certain black SUV, matching your county fleet, financial records of an attempted land grab, and a very interesting money trail. You're under arrest for attempted murder, corruption, and extortion." Riley's face drained of all color. He looked at his deputies, but they were already stepping away from him, dropping their weapons into the dirt to surrender to the feds. The bikers stood in absolute, intimidating silence, watching the corrupt sheriff's empire crumble in seconds. Jax turned away from the arrest and limped up the wooden steps of the porch. Arthur slowly opened the front door, still holding his M1 Garand, though the barrel was pointed firmly at the floor. He looked at the sea of leather and chrome in his front yard, then looked at the towering biker in front of him. "You came back," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. Jax reached out, wrapping his massive, tattooed arms around the old mechanic in a fierce embrace. "I told you, Arthur. The club pays its debts. Always." Jax pulled back and reached into his leather cut. He pulled out a small, meticulously embroidered patch. It wasn't the full death's head that had to be earned in blood, but it was a square patch that read AFFA, Angels Forever, Forever Angels, with a small, red-winged skull in the center. "This property is under the protection of the Oakland Charter," Jax said loudly, ensuring every federal agent, deputy, and biker heard him. He pressed the patch into Arthur's weathered hand. "Anyone touches this land, anyone touches you, they answer to us." Arthur looked down at the patch, then out at the 100 men who had ridden across the frozen desert to save a solitary old man they had never met. For the first time since his wife passed away, the crushing weight of loneliness lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't just a forgotten mechanic at the edge of the world anymore. He was family. Highway 50 remains the loneliest road in America, but Arthur Carrington never feels the isolation. His land is safe. The corrupt sheriff rots in federal prison, and the desert winds carry a different tune. Nailed prominently to the wooden gate at the edge of his driveway is a small, red-winged skull. It stands as a silent, absolute warning. The old man is not alone, and thunder is always just over the horizon.